They always believe the man with power, until the truth learns how to speak for itself. The chandelier lights spilled across polished marble, catching the shimmer of champagne glasses and diamond watches as laughter echoed through the Whitmore Foundation Gala. Every camera angled toward the stage where Ethan Whitmore stood in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his presence commanding, his voice calm, as if the world itself bent to his certainty. And just a few feet away, Amara Hayes stood still in a simple black dress, one hand resting lightly against her stomach, her breath slow, controlled, as if she had rehearsed silence instead of defense, because she knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth, because men like him didn't whisper their denial, they performed it. And when he finally turned his gaze toward her, the room followed like a tide, every conversation dissolving into a hush sharp enough to cut. And then he said it, not loud, not angry, just precise. "Let's be clear. That child is not mine." And the words landed colder than the air-conditioned ballroom, colder than the glass in her hand, colder than the space that opened between her ribs as 100 eyes shifted from him to her, searching, judging, waiting for a reaction she refused to give, because dignity didn't beg under chandeliers. It stood still, even when the ground beneath it cracked, and somewhere in the crowd a phone lifted, then another, tiny screens glowing like witnesses eager to capture the fall. But Amara didn't fall. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even blink right away. She just inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that steadies something deeper than pain. And for a moment the only sound was the faint clink of glass against glass and the distant hum of the city outside those tall windows. A reminder that life kept moving even when yours tried to collapse in front of an audience. And Ethan, still composed, still untouchable in his certainty, lifted his glass again as if closing a business deal, as if he had just erased her with a sentence. And maybe to everyone else in that room, he had, because power had a way of rewriting truth in real time. But what they couldn't see, what no camera could capture, was the quiet shift behind Amara's eyes, the moment something inside her stopped waiting to be believed, because beneath the fabric of her dress, beneath the steady rise and fall of her breath, there was a life that didn't need approval, didn't need permission, didn't need his name to exist. And that was the truth she carried, heavier than judgment, stronger than shame. And without a word, without giving the room the spectacle it expected, she set her glass down on the nearest table with a soft, deliberate motion, turned, and walked away through the parted crowd, her steps measured, her spine straight, leaving behind the echo of his denial and the illusion that he was still in control of what came next. Because somewhere beyond those doors, beyond the reach of flashing cameras and whispered opinions, the truth was already growing, already waiting, already preparing for the moment it would no longer ask to be believed, but prove itself undeniable. The city air felt colder than it should have when Amara stepped out onto the sidewalk, the glass doors closing behind her with a quiet finality that no applause could match. And for a moment, she just stood there beneath the glow of streetlights, the noise of passing cars blurring into something distant, something irrelevant, because inside her chest her heartbeat was louder than anything the world could offer, steady but heavy, like it was learning how to carry more than just her own weight. And she placed her hand over her stomach again, not out of fear, not out of doubt, but out of instinct, a silent reassurance that what was growing inside her was real, even if the man who helped create it had just erased it in front of a room full of witnesses. And she exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the night air, before taking her first step forward, heels clicking softly against the pavement as she walked with no destination other than away, because sometimes survival was not about knowing where you were going, but knowing where you refused to stay. And by the time she reached the corner, the city had already swallowed the story the gala had tried to define, because out here there were no cameras, no curated narratives, just the quiet truth that followed her like a second shadow. And days turned into weeks with a rhythm that did not ask for permission, mornings that began before sunrise and nights that ended long after. Her body begged for rest, as she balanced two jobs that barely covered rent in a small one-bedroom apartment across town, a space that held more silence than furniture, where the hum of an old refrigerator and the distant echo of traffic became her only companions. And yet she never once reached for her phone to call him, never once typed his name into a message she would not send, because she had already heard his answer, already felt the weight of his denial, and she refused to ask twice for something that should have been given freely the first time. And when the first doctor appointment came, she sat alone in a quiet examination room, the paper beneath her crinkling softly as she leaned back, her eyes fixed on the ceiling until the technician smiled gently and turned the monitor toward her. And that was the moment everything shifted, not with noise, not with drama, but with a flicker, a small, steady heartbeat that filled the room with a sound too real to ignore, too strong to deny. And Amara's breath caught as she watched it, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table, because for the first time since that night, the truth was not something she had to defend. It was something she could see, something she could hear, something that did not need anyone's belief to exist. And a single tear slipped down her temple, not from sadness, but from the quiet release of knowing she was no longer carrying this alone, even if she was the only one standing in that room. And outside those walls, Ethan Whitmore moved through his world unchanged, board meetings, interviews, headlines that praised his precision and control, a man who had built an empire on certainty, unaware that somewhere across the city, certainty had already begun to slip through his fingers in the form of a heartbeat he had refused to acknowledge. And while he signed contracts and closed deals, Amara built something far more unshakable, one quiet decision at a time, one breath at a time, one step at a time, until the day came when the truth would no longer wait in silence, but arrive in a way he could never dismiss again. Time did not rush for Amara. It moved with intention, each day stretching just enough to test her strength without breaking it. And as the months passed, her body began to change in ways that made the truth visible even to strangers. The gentle curve beneath her coat, the slower pace of her steps, the quiet pauses when she needed to breathe a little deeper, and still she carried herself with the same steady composure, as if dignity had become second nature rather than something she had to fight to keep. And the world around her noticed in fragments. A cashier offering a softer smile, a woman on the bus giving up her seat without being asked, small moments of humanity that asked no questions and offered no judgment. And in those quiet exchanges, she found something unexpected, not validation, not sympathy, but a kind of balance that reminded her she was not invisible. She was simply choosing where to be seen. And each evening when she returned to her apartment, she would place her keys on the same worn table, kick off her shoes, and rest her hand against her stomach as if greeting someone who had been waiting for her all day. And the silence that once felt heavy now felt shared, filled with the soft awareness of a life growing stronger with every passing week. And then one afternoon, as golden light slipped through the blinds and painted long lines across the floor, she felt it for the first time, a small, unmistakable movement, like a gentle tap from the inside. And she froze, her breath catching as her hand pressed more firmly against her stomach, waiting. And there it was again, a quiet confirmation that what she had seen on that screen, what she had heard in that steady rhythm, was now reaching back, and a slow smile touched her lips, not wide, not dramatic, but real, because in that moment the truth was no longer something distant or abstract. It was alive, present, undeniable, and she whispered softly, her voice barely above the hum of the room, as if the walls themselves might carry her words where they needed to go. And across the city, in a high-rise office lined with glass and steel, Ethan Whitmore stood before a long conference table, his reflection stretching across polished surfaces as he reviewed figures and projections, his voice controlled, his decisions precise, the kind of man who built outcomes before anyone else could question them. And yet, even in that carefully structured world, something had begun to shift, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, a hesitation in a sentence, a pause where there had never been one before, because stories had a way of lingering even when they were dismissed. And the memory of that night, of her standing there without breaking, without pleading, without giving him the reaction he expected, returned to him in quiet moments, not as guilt, not yet, but as something he could not fully explain, a question, without a place to land. And he brushed it aside the same way he dismissed anything that did not fit his narrative, with logic, with certainty, with the belief that control was enough to define reality. But while he refined strategies and secured contracts, life moved forward beyond his reach. And on a crisp morning weeks later, Amara sat once again in a familiar examination room. The same soft light, the same steady hum. But this time she did not stare at the ceiling, she watched the screen. With quiet anticipation, her hand resting where she now felt those small movements more often. And when the image appeared, clearer now, more defined, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes tracing the shape that was becoming unmistakably human, and the technician smiled as she pointed gently, explaining measurements and progress. But Amara barely heard the words, because what mattered was not the data, not the numbers, but the presence, the proof that needed no argument. And as the sound of that heartbeat filled the room again, stronger, louder, unwavering, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting it settle into her, knowing that somewhere beyond all the denial and distance, the truth was growing in a way that could not be stopped, could not be rewritten, and could not be erased, no matter how powerful the man who once tried to deny it might be. Winter arrived quietly, not with a storm, but with a steady drop in temperature that turned breath into visible clouds and sidewalks into careful paths, and Amara adjusted to it the same way she had adjusted to everything else, without complaint, without spectacle, layering her coat over the life she carried, moving through her days with a rhythm that no longer felt fragile but deliberate, as if each step had purpose beyond survival. And by the time the first snow dusted the edges of the city, her world had narrowed and deepened all at once, centered around the quiet preparation of a future she was building piece by piece, folding tiny clothes she had bought on clearance, assembling a crib with careful hands in the corner of her apartment, pausing every so often to rest as the weight she carried became impossible to ignore, and yet there was no bitterness in her movements, no lingering question of what could have been, only a calm acceptance of what was. And on a late afternoon when the sky turned pale and the city slowed under the hush of falling snow, the moment arrived not with chaos, but with a quiet urgency that she met with the same steady strength she had carried all along. Hours later, in a softly lit hospital room, the world shifted again, not in silence this time, but in the small, unmistakable cry of new life. And when the nurse placed the baby gently against her chest, everything else fell away, the past, the gala, the denial, the distance, all of it dissolving into something that no longer had power over her, because in her arms was truth in its purest form, warm, breathing, undeniable, and she looked down at him, her son, her fingers tracing the curve of his cheek with a tenderness that needed no witness. And then she saw it, not as a shock, not as a revelation, but as a quiet confirmation of something she had always known, the shape of his eyes, the line of his nose, the unmistakable echo of a man who had refused to see himself in this child. And for a moment her breath stilled, not from pain but from the weight of what that resemblance meant, not for her, but for the future that would eventually ask questions, and she exhaled slowly, pressing her lips gently to his forehead, as if sealing a promise she would never speak aloud, that he would never feel like something denied, never feel like something unwanted. And outside that room the world continued in its usual rhythm, unaware that a truth had just taken its first breath. And across the city, Ethan Whitmore stood in a private dining room surrounded by investors and partners, the table set with precision, conversations flowing with the confidence of men who believed they understood the direction of their lives. And yet, even in that controlled environment, something disrupted the pattern, a message delivered quietly by an assistant, a legal notice that required his attention, something involving a pending inheritance case tied to extended family holdings, routine on the surface, but with a clause that demanded verification, lineage, proof. And he glanced at it briefly, irritation flickering across his otherwise composed expression, because details like this were usually handled long before they reached him. And yet the word lingered longer than it should have, proof, and he dismissed it with the same efficiency he applied to everything else, unaware that somewhere not far from where he stood, the very proof he had denied was now wrapped in a soft hospital blanket, breathing steadily, waiting not for recognition, not for acceptance, but for the moment when truth would no longer be something he could ignore. The days after the hospital did not feel like a dramatic shift, they felt like a quiet unfolding, as if life had simply turned a page without announcing it. And Amara moved through those early mornings and long nights with a calm that surprised even her, the soft weight of her son against her chest becoming the center of everything. His small breath steady and warm, his presence grounding her in a way nothing else ever had. And the apartment that once felt too quiet now carried a different kind of silence, one filled with meaning, with purpose, with the subtle sounds of a new life learning the rhythm of the world. And she learned it with him, adjusting to the gentle interruptions of sleep, to the way time no longer belonged to schedules but to needs, to the quiet moments when she would sit by the window and watch the city move while he rested in her arms, her fingers tracing the soft curve of his face, still noticing the details that made her pause, the familiar line of his brow, the way his eyes seemed to hold a depth far beyond their days. And each time she saw it, she did not feel anger. She felt clarity, because resemblance was no longer a question waiting to be answered. It was a fact living and breathing in front of her, and she did not need anyone else to confirm what she already knew. And across the city, Ethan Whitmore sat in a private office. The same glass walls, the same controlled environment, but the documents in front of him were no longer routine. The inheritance case that had once seemed like a minor inconvenience had expanded into something more precise, more demanding, requiring verification of biological ties that could not be overlooked, and his legal team spoke in measured tones, explaining procedures, outlining requirements. But there was a shift in the air, something less certain than usual, because for the first time, the process was not something that could be managed with strategy alone. It required something he had built his reputation on avoiding, personal truth, and he listened with a composed expression, his posture unchanged. But there was a flicker beneath the surface, a hesitation that had not existed before, because the word proof had returned again, this time not as a passing detail, but as a central demand. And as the meeting concluded and the room emptied, he remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened glass, sharp, controlled, but not entirely untouched, because memory had a way of resurfacing when certainty was challenged. And the image of her standing there, silent and unshaken under the weight of his denial, did not fade as easily as he had expected, and he stood slowly, straightening his jacket as if returning himself to the version of control he was known for. But even as he did, the thought lingered, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent, and days later in a quiet medical facility far removed from the noise of his usual world, he found himself sitting across from a specialist, the atmosphere clinical, neutral, stripped of the power dynamics he was accustomed to, and as forms were placed before him, explanations given with professional detachment, he followed the process with the same precision he applied to everything else, signing where needed, answering questions without hesitation, because to him, this was still procedure, still something that would confirm what he had already declared. And yet as the final sample was taken and sealed with a level of care that suggested its significance, there was a moment, brief but undeniable, where silence settled in a way that felt different, not empty, but expectant, and he rose from his seat without comment, leaving the room with the quiet confidence of a man who believed outcomes could be predicted, unaware that somewhere not far from where he stood, Amara rocked her son gently in the soft glow of evening light, whispering words he did not yet understand but would one day feel, her voice steady, her presence unwavering, as the truth she had carried alone prepared itself to step beyond silence and into a reality that no denial could ever reshape. The weight did not announce itself as something heavy. It settled quietly into Ethan's schedule, threading through meetings and calls, lingering in the pauses between decisions where certainty used to live without question. And although he continued moving through his days with the same measured control, there was a subtle shift in the way he processed time, as if something unseen had begun to count it differently. And in the sterile corridors of the medical facility, the sealed results moved through systems that did not recognize status or influence, handled with the same neutrality as any other case, because truth in its purest form did not adjust itself to power. It simply waited to be revealed, and across the city, Amara had already stopped waiting, her world no longer shaped by what he might or might not do, but by what was already real in her arms. And that evening, she sat near the window, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light across the room as her son rested against her shoulder, his breathing slow and steady, His small hand curled gently against her sweater, and she swayed slightly without thinking, the motion instinctive, grounding, as if her body understood something her mind had long accepted, that she was no longer carrying a question, she was raising an answer, and she spoke to him softly, her voice low, not for explanation but for connection, telling him about the world outside those walls, about the city lights and the quiet strength it takes to stand when no one stands with you. And though he could not understand the words, he responded in the only way he knew how, with calm, with presence, with the simple truth of being there, and miles away, in an office that overlooked the skyline. Ethan stood alone as his assistant placed a discreet envelope on the desk, its surface unmarked except for a reference number that carried more weight than it appeared to. And for a moment he did not reach for it, not out of fear, but out of something unfamiliar, a hesitation that had no place in the life he had built, because every outcome in his world had always been anticipated, calculated, controlled, and yet this was different, not because of complexity, but because of its simplicity, and when he finally picked it up, the room seemed quieter than usual, the faint hum of the city below fading into the background as his attention narrowed to the thin line where the envelope would open, and there was no dramatic shift, no sudden realization, just a stillness that settled over him as the paper slid free, his eyes scanning the page with the same precision he applied to contracts and reports, until they stopped, not gradually, but completely, on a number that did not require interpretation, 99.99%, and in that instant, the structure he relied on did not collapse outwardly. There was no visible reaction, no raised voice, no movement at all, but internally. Something shifted in a way that could not be reversed, because the one thing he had denied with absolute certainty had now returned with absolute clarity, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with every moment he had dismissed, every assumption he had made, every word he had spoken as if it defined reality. And for the first time, reality stood independent of him, unshaken by his denial. And he lowered the paper slowly, his reflection in the glass no longer as sharp as it had been before, not because it had changed, but because he had. And across the city, unaware of the exact moment the truth reached him, Amara adjusted the blanket around her son and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, her eyes closing briefly as if sealing something unspoken, because whether he accepted it or not had never changed what was real, and now, without needing to witness it, she had already moved beyond the point where his belief mattered at all. The number did not leave Ethan's mind. It followed him into every room, every meeting, every quiet moment where he once relied on certainty to carry him forward. And for the first time in years, control felt like something distant, something that could not reach what had already been proven, and the paper itself remained on his desk longer than anything else ever had, untouched but impossible to ignore, as if its presence alone was enough to shift the balance of everything he thought he understood. And days passed not with resolution, but with a growing awareness that this was not a situation he could delegate, not a problem that could be solved through strategy or negotiation, because there was no angle to manage, no narrative to reshape, there was only truth. And truth did not require permission, and across the city, Amara moved through her life with a steadiness that no longer carried the weight of waiting, her days now defined by the small, but meaningful rhythms of motherhood. The early morning light filtering through the curtains as she prepared a bottle, the quiet hum of lullabies she never realized she knew, the soft weight of her son in her arms as he began to notice the world in small, curious ways, and each moment built something stronger inside her, something that had nothing to do with the man who had once denied him, because her focus was no longer on what had been taken or rejected, but on what she was creating. And one afternoon, as sunlight warmed the room and her son lay peacefully beside her, she noticed it again, the resemblance that had never faded but only grown clearer with time, the way his eyes followed movement, the shape of his expression when he was calm, details that did not ask for acknowledgement but existed plainly, undeniably. And she did not look away, she did not question it. She simply accepted it as part of the truth she had always carried. And miles away, Ethan finally reached a point where stillness was no longer enough, where silence no longer protected him from what he now knew. and he found himself standing outside a building far removed from the glass towers and polished environments he was used to, a place defined not by power, but by everyday life. And for a moment he did not move, his posture still composed, but his presence uncertain in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew him. Because this was not a negotiation, this was not a presentation. This was a step into something he could not control, and when he finally entered, the space felt smaller, quieter, more real than anything he had been part of in a long time. And he followed the information he had been given, each step bringing him closer to a door that represented more than just a location. And when he stood in front of it, the distance between who he had been and what he now faced felt unmistakable. And for a brief moment, he hesitated, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood for the first time that what came next would not be defined by him. And inside, unaware of the exact moment he arrived, Amara adjusted the blanket around her son, her movements calm, her focus steady, as if the world beyond those walls held no urgency that could disrupt what she had built. And when the knock finally came, soft but deliberate, it did not startle her, it did not rush her, it simply existed, waiting, just like the truth had always done. And she rose slowly, her steps measured, her expression unchanged as she moved toward the door, not as someone bracing for confrontation, but as someone who had already survived everything that mattered. And when her hand reached for the handle, there was no fear in it, only clarity, because whatever stood on the other side no longer had the power to define her, only the chance to face what she had already accepted. The door opened without urgency, without hesitation, and Amara stood there facing him with the same quiet composure she had carried from the very beginning, her expression steady, her eyes clear, as if the moment he had spent days building in his mind had already passed for her long before he arrived. And Ethan Whitmore, a man who had commanded boardrooms and shaped outcomes with a single sentence, found himself without one now, because standing in front of her was not a situation he could navigate with authority. It was something far simpler and far more difficult, truth without distance. And for a brief second neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with everything that had been said and everything that had not. And then his gaze shifted, almost involuntarily, drawn past her to the small figure resting inside, and the world narrowed in a way he had never experienced before, not to numbers or decisions or strategy, but to something entirely outside of those constructs. And Amara did not move to block his view, did not step aside to invite him in. She simply stood, allowing the moment to exist on its own terms, because she no longer needed to control what he saw or felt. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than it had ever been, stripped of the certainty that once defined it. I saw the results. And the words did not carry power, they carried acknowledgement. And she nodded once, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in recognition of something that had already been established long before he read it on paper. And the silence that followed was different now, no longer weighted with denial, but with the absence of it. And he took a step forward, careful, measured, as if the ground itself required a different kind of awareness, and his eyes returned to the child, taking in the details he had once refused to imagine, the small features that mirrored his own in ways that no report could fully capture. And something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know him, but enough to break the structure he had relied on for so long. Because this was no longer abstract, it was present, immediate, undeniable, and he exhaled slowly, as if adjusting to a reality that no longer fit within the boundaries he had set. I was wrong, he said, the words simple, direct, and unfamiliar in their lack of defense. And Amara listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, because this was not the moment she had been waiting for. It was simply a moment that had arrived. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying no trace of accusation. You were certain, and there was no emphasis, no added weight, just a reflection of what had been. And he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding, because certainty had been the foundation of everything he built. And now it stood challenged by something he could not reshape. And he looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a situation to resolve, not as a variable to consider, but as the person who had carried this truth alone without asking him to believe it. And for the first time, the distance between them felt less like space and more like consequence. And he took another step, stopping just short of crossing the threshold, because something in him recognized that this was not a space he could enter without being allowed. And Amara did not move to close the door, did not move to open it further. She simply held her place, her son behind her, her presence steady, as if to remind him without words that everything he now faced had existed long before he chose to acknowledge it. And the quiet stretched between them, not uncomfortable, not unresolved, but clear, because, for the first time, nothing needed to be argued, nothing needed to be proven. The truth stood there on its own, and what remained was not whether he believed it, but what he would do now that he could no longer deny it. He did not move immediately, and for a man who had built his life on decisive action, that stillness said more than any statement he could have made, because standing there, just outside the threshold of a life he had once dismissed, Ethan Whitmore understood something that had never existed in his world before, that access was not guaranteed, that presence had to be earned, and that truth did not automatically grant him a place within it. And Amara watched him with the same calm she had carried through every stage of this journey, her expression neither closed nor inviting, simply certain, because she had already lived through the hardest part without him, and nothing about this moment could undo that. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something new, not authority, not expectation, but restraint. "I want to understand what I need to do." And the words were careful, measured, as if he knew that anything more would break the fragile honesty he was trying to hold onto. And she tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement of the shift, because this was not the man who had stood under bright lights and erased her with a sentence. This was someone standing in the aftermath of his own certainty. And for a moment, she let the silence answer him, because not every question required an immediate response. Some required time to settle, to reveal whether they were rooted in truth or in habit. And behind her, her son stirred softly, a small sound that drew both of their attention, and without hesitation, without performance. Amara turned and lifted him gently into her arms, her movements instinctive, fluid, as if the world beyond that space did not exist when he needed her. And Ethan watched, not with the detached observation he once applied to everything, but with something far more personal, something that did not fit into any category he understood, because this was not a concept, not a responsibility outlined in legal terms. It was a presence, a connection that existed without explanation. And when Amara turned back toward him, her son resting comfortably against her, she met his gaze again, steady, unwavering. And this time when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that did not need to be raised. "You do not start with him," she said, and the words landed not as rejection, but as direction. And he listened, fully, without interruption, because for the first time, he understood that this was not about claiming a role. It was about becoming someone worthy of it. And she continued, her tone unchanged. "You start with the truth you refuse to see." And there was no accusation in her words, only fact, only the foundation of everything that had led them here. And he nodded slowly, absorbing it, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct, only something to face, and the distance between them remained. But it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a boundary, one that defined what had been and what could be. And outside, the city moved as it always had, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside that small apartment, where power no longer dictated outcome and silence no longer meant weakness. And as the moment settled, Amara adjusted her hold on her son, her hand resting protectively against his back, her presence grounding, complete. And Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping away, but standing in a place that required something he had never had to offer before: patience. And for the first time, he did not try to change that, did not try to control the pace, because he understood now that this was not a situation to win. It was a truth to grow into. And as the quiet stretched between them, filled not with uncertainty, but with possibility, one thing became clear without either of them needing to say it: that everything moving forward would not be decided by power or proof, but by the choices he made from this moment on. And whether those choices would ever be enough was something only time, and the woman who had already proven she did not need him, would decide.